Hover mode. Why is it a thing in the game? Why do we need to talk about it? Why do the devs want it? And why it will never work? Not an overly ambitious video, but we'll try it anyways. Shouldn't take long. Our journey starts here at Port Olisar. Now, Port Olisar is one of the oldest features of the persistent universe. This goes all the way back to the 2.0 series of patches. This, station is almost 4 or 5 years old now at this point, possibly even 6. I'd have to go back and double check it, but as the years run by in Star Citizen's development, these things kind of slip into the misty shade of the past. But what I'm doing right now is I'm going and I'm getting into my caterpillar, right? Completely ordinary, nothing wrong with that, except for one thing. The landing pad that I'm on right now is not enclosed. So anyone outside of the station, when I ordered up my caterpillar from the display panel inside the station, my caterpillar simply winked into existence. And we see this all the time. We see this at a lot of the kind of open air landing sites. That is the reason why Port Olisar is going to disappear at some point in the future, because you simply can't have that in Star Citizen because it breaks immersion. And it is a legitimate concern. So the landing sites in Port Olisar and everywhere else had to change. That's why we got the newer space stations. The newer space stations that you see here are intended to replace Olisar. Olisar is something that is going to go away, or at least get some very significant changes. Now, the newer space stations, of course, have the internal volume to let you land a ship within them. So that way, when you spawn a ship, or you despawn a ship when you land it and then get off your ship and go away, no one actually sees that ship wink out of existence. It is simply considered, oh, well, they moved it into a storage area, but you didn't see it happen, so on and so forth. That is what CIG is going for. They're going for that level of realism. If you look on the roadmap right now, they're even taking into account the fact that cargo shouldn't be instantly loaded or offloaded off your ship. There's going to be a timer. I think it's scheduled for 3.9 or 4.0. That is going to be introduced into the game so that when you land a ship at one of these space stations, unload the cargo, it's going to take a certain amount of time to offload that cargo. That is the level of realism that they're going for. That's why you can't see ships simply blink in and out of existence. And chances are, even being able to spawn a fighter or a heavy fighter on these landing pads in the future is probably going to be something that goes away along with this. So this is why we have the large internal hangars that we have now. As we play the game currently, when you go to a place like Lorville, Area 18, or any of the other major spawning areas where you might bring out a ship, you have these large internal spaces, and sooner or later, Olisar is either going to be destroyed or it's going to become like this. So that way, within this enclosed space, you can simply wink a ship into existence, and the players all around that area are none the wiser that it happened. Immersion is not broken. Everyone is happy. That is the aesthetic that they're going for. But these kind of deep internal hangars, they do come with a bit of an issue. Navigating into and out of these landing spaces can be a little bit challenging, especially when you don't have a flight control system that is cooperating with you. Now, the problem with hover mode, as it was implemented in the game, it meant that if you tilted your ship one way, your ship would slide one way. If you tilted your ship the other way, it would slide into that direction, much like a helicopter does. And this is, when we're talking about this, we're of course talking about planetary landings. Now, the problem with that is that it didn't account for the way the landing sites had been built in the game. While it did remain a fairly decent idea at face value upon deeper analysis, it didn't match up with the realities of the game and the way that it was being built. Remember, we need these enclosed landing spaces to hide ships when they're winking in and out of existence. But these enclosed landing spaces make it exceptionally difficult to land a spaceship within them if the ship is, a little bit uncooperative. Now, many people, of course, will tell you that practice makes perfect. You simply have to practice this enough times, and eventually you'll get so good at it that there really won't be a risk. But there's another problem, you see, and that is the cockpits in Star Citizen. Now, the Caterpillar is probably the least offensive of the larger ships in terms of cockpit usability. It does have a certain amount of downward view to it, but it's not all that much, which means you have to tilt the entirety of the ship downwards to see where you're trying to go. The other option, of course, is to use third-person view, but Star Citizen is supposed to be a first-person game. So while it's easier to land the ship in third person, you're not really supposed to be experiencing the game that way. So you're supposed to be experiencing it in the first person, but because we have all this wonderful, essentially dead instrumentation in our ship that doesn't reveal anything important to us about what we're trying to do, and rather just is a bunch of useless, status displays for systems that you rarely ever interact with beyond keybinds, it takes up a lot of space that would otherwise allow you to easily navigate without having to tilt your ship downwards into a landing position. And in tilting your ship downwards, your ship would immediately start to go forwards and downwards, and it would be very difficult to recover from that. And that's the challenge that's facing Star Citizen right now, is the ships and the landing sites are not currently built to account for something like hover mode. And even in the future, with things being added into the UI, recently, once again, we talked about, or at least they talked about, the need for a landing UI, something hopefully not too dissimilar from the one that you get when you do planetary landings or landing pads in Elite Dangerous, which is basically an ideal system, and I wouldn't complain at all if they lifted it one for one. But right now, the ships and the landing sites in the game just don't account for hover mode. That is the problem. Is hover mode simply cannot work in Star Citizen, because having that type of motion in Starship the ships aren't built for it, and the universe isn't built for it. The landing sites aren't built for it, and all the work that's been done on all these landing sites so far would essentially have to be scrapped and redone in order to account for something like hover mode. And most of the ship's cockpits would have to be redesigned, or the MFDs would have to add additional functionality like remote cameras that allow you to view on a downwards forward angle and a rearward angle and all that sort of stuff, which Star Citizen, the devs have said that they don't want to do because it is too taxing on the CPU to have to render images from all these different angles. This is something that they've told us in the past. So this is kind of the paradox that we're trapped within. But is hover mode necessary? Well, sadly, to a certain degree, it kind of is. So for this example, I'm going to use the in-game drug labs. We all know about them. We've all probably visited them from time to time to make a little bit of money, but this is probably one of the most prominent examples of why hover mode is necessary to a degree. When 3.0 came out, of course, we got moons and then eventually planets that we could land on. And there were various landing sites. Drug sites were one of them. And so a lot of players would congregate in these areas because it turns out that selling illegal drugs is very profitable. Well, depending on which patch you were playing. So what ended up happening is players, of course, were congregating at these locations. Now, there are many other landing sites where this was happening to a certain degree, but one of the things that would happen the most around places like Jumptown and whatnot is that players would hover their ships outside of it, and they would watch for another player to go in, and then they would simply hover outside with their ship and gun down, either the ship while it was landing or the person running from, the actual location back to their spaceship, so on and so forth. And what this kind of revealed was that we had all these ships that were basically floating around turreting in space in a gravitational field, and it didn't make sense. It looked kind of dumb. It wasn't the end of the world, but it did look kind of stupid. And it made gameplay to a certain degree when you were on the ground a little bit unfair because anybody could simply sit up there and turret you in space. And though ultimately hover mode looked to solve some of that by making it much more difficult to do things like that, it really didn't solve the problem, because all you really needed to do was bring in a bigger ship that could simply hover, because all the ships need to be able to hover, especially the ones that enter an atmosphere. If it had a bottom turret on it, you could just simply get somebody to go into the bottom turret and do that anyways. So even with hover mode implemented in all its glory, it really didn't solve the problem, except for solving the idea of a ship could stand on its nose 5 feet off the ground and seemingly pay no consequence for it. The downside, of course, was the fact that landing a ship on a planet or on a moon, especially a smaller ship, which are inherently far more unstable than the larger ships, became increasingly difficult. I mean, to a point of actually being somewhat ridiculous. You know, I put up a video, and I was trying to find the footage for this video, but I put up this video of all these people trying to land at Lorville after hover mode had been implemented, and there was, one of a Cutlass just completely bouncing off of a building and spinning out of control and exploding, while I'm standing next to the wreck of the Vanguard that I tried to take off with, that somehow flipped over and nearly killed me. It became stupid. In a way, it kind of closed the door on one kind of stupid and opened a door to a whole other kind of stupid. Now, once again, you can say practice makes perfect, but in a universe like Star Citizen, where things are already challenging enough, remember, this isn't like any other MMO where it's like, oh, you die, you run back from the graveyard, you claim your body, boom, and you're back in the action. No. This is a universe of permanent consequences, and so even the slightest loss of attention or anything like that could have catastrophic results, which may not be always what you want from a video game. You want a certain amount of realism and you want a certain amount of challenge, but you can get to levels where things get a little bit stupid and a little bit over the top. At the end of the day, it's supposed to be a video game and it's supposed to be fun, so where do you find the balance? Now, while hover mode seems like kind of a good idea, the biggest problem with trying to implement hover mode, especially right now, is that Star Citizen, surprisingly enough, is not really all that stable of a product. It has a few bugs, one or two here or there. And so when you're trying to implement a system like this, when you're trying to, affect something that is so necessary to so many activities in the Star Citizen universe, like landing your spaceship, when the game struggles to even get the idea of a spaceship landing correctly, when the game, is struggling so badly, this probably isn't a time to really say, oh, you know what, now would be a good time to ramp up the difficulty, because obviously, we have such a stable platform to start from. You really don't, right? And while entertaining, in a universe where you can lose your assets and you can lose a lot of money, this isn't really a stable place to really try to implement something like this. So I think that, in a way, the best solution right now is to kind of hold off. It's kind of to step back from it and think about what you really want to do with the Star Citizen universe. Do you want to redesign all the landing sites and the ship cockpits? No, you don't. Do you want to put in a landing system that punishes players? I would say a little too severely, especially those in the smaller ships, which are the most numerous in the Star Citizen universe. Probably not. So, smart guy, what's the answer? Well, I'm glad you asked, because I'm going to give it to you. Do nothing. Don't change a thing until you have your UI and your new landing systems that you've been talking about implemented in the game. Leave it as is. It's a necessary evil right now. It is what it is. Just leave things alone. Don't touch them. Wait until you have your new 3D UI that's all fancy and all the cool stuff, and it's bespoke and systematic and all the other buzzwords. Once you have that in place, and you now have that system that can give players a proper display of what's on the ground beneath them, once you have all that in place, and it's working, that's the important word here, it works. Once you have that, then you turn around and you take ships and you say that below a certain altitude, whether you're, however far you want it to make it off the ground, your ship will transition into a level flight mode, which basically is kind of, think of it as like kind of a computer assisted landing mode. There's none of this turn to, tilt to the right, your ship starts to slip to the right, tilt to the left, your ship starts to slip to the left. What you do is you basically make it so that below a certain altitude, the ship basically transitions into a level computer assisted flight mode, and you would have to use that new UI to navigate down to the ground and land your ship. Now you'll still have the ability to, if your ship has a bottom turret, to gun down things on the ground, but you'll no longer be able to tilt your nose beyond a certain very minuscule amount towards the ground. You won't need to do it to land your ship anymore because you'll be able to see where you're going. You'll be able to see all the obstacles in your way, so that takes the landing difficulties out of the equation, and then a player can stably move their ship in and side slip or drop or fly forwards into a landing site without any major issues. And it also eliminates the possibility of someone simply turning their ship on its nose and simply gunning down anything on the ground. You will now have a system that works. But until you have that UI, you don't have anything. You don't have anything to build hover mode off of. And certainly trying to build hover mode off of the game in its current state is like trying to build the Empire State Building on top of like a swamp or quicksand. It's not really a stable foundation to try to do something so monumental. Now, some people may not like the idea of a ship being restricted to a very limited amount of being able to tilt and move when it moves in for a landing or when it gets too close to the surface of the planet. But if you do have that enhanced UI in place and you do have a three-dimensional map being projected somewhere where the pilot can see it usefully in front of them, then that's going to give you all the information that you really need, and maybe it can be enhanced to show, people on the ground or whatnot so a pilot can help move. But I think that restricts the ability to attack ground targets to things like turrets and stuff like that, or trying to make strafing runs but not getting below a certain altitude, which would be unfair and may balance things out to a certain degree. It's going to be a challenge, but I think that given the way that the ships are designed, is probably your best hope. Now, of course, how far or how high you have to be off the ground for that to kick in, that's something that can be tested and debated into the future. But from my point of view, that's the best way to implement something that achieves what hover mode aimed to achieve without paying the huge penalty that hover mode was clearly not designed to pay. Anyways, that's the show for today. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and thanks for watching.
Thank you for watching. So if you want to keep up with the latest and greatest in Star Citizen and Squadron 42's development, please follow us on our social media channels. See you soon.